So this next section, folks, a lot more straightforward in my opinion. A lot easier in my opinion. Really, more than anything, this next section is a lot of vocab, right? Flashcard stuff more than anything. Not super analytical, not super confusing, just making sure, sometimes you gotta do what you gotta do. Making sure that you kind of can differentiate between different words. That's really what this comes down to. So this whole section deals with land use controls. And we've started talking about land use controls, right? And when we're dealing with land use controls, we can break them into two main categories, private and public. Of course, literally, we're going to give you a slide here in a second. Private affects private property owners and are imposed by private property owners, right? When you own property, you can set rules on your property within the scope of the law. So private land use controls are set by private property owners. Public means government. Public land use controls are set by the government for the betterment of the government, of the municipality, of the public. So there's a lot of different pieces that go into both public and private land use controls, and you got to be careful. But it's just a lot of vocab in this section more than anything. So, as I just stated, public land use controls, government. Private land use controls, not government. Let me help you out here. Folks, if you have restrictive covenants that say that you can't have chickens in your neighborhood, and let's say that your neighbor gets chickens and you don't like it, and you pick up the phone and you call the police, what do you think the police is going to do about the fact that your neighbor has chickens? There you go. A lot of you are shaking your head. I'm going to translate that to nothing. They are not going to do anything. The police is the government. Government control is use of police power to enforce laws. Private land use controls are not government. The police does not care that your neighbor has chickens. They will not do anything about it. If you don't like private land use controls, you sue your neighbor in court. You file an injunction. You take him to court. Private land use controls are enforced by private property owners. Public land use controls are enforced by the government. Now, let me explain this note here because people have a tendency to get confused on this. Okay, the bottom note says both are equally important and the stricter rule overrides the less restrictive rule. Okay, real world lesson for you here. Folks, I live right on the edge of Wake County and Johnston County, but I am in fact in Johnston County. And I'm going to tell y'all, we call it JOCO for short, all right? Y'all don't know nothing about JOCO. They call it JOCO for short. Let me tell you everything you need to know about JOCO in one fell swoop. Recently, they celebrated a holiday, and they do it every year out in Benson. And this holiday is called Mule Day. Yeah, Brooks knew what I was going. He's like, facts, Mule Day. Mule Day, folks, if you don't know what a mule is, it's a half horse, half donkey. Okay, that's a mule. And they have a holiday called Mule Days in Benson, and I hear it's a hoot nanny and a half. Okay, that tells you everything you need to know about JOCO. Brooks says it's mid, but all right. So, here's where I'm getting at, folks. In Johnston County, my house zoning is AR, stands for Agricultural Residential. And so, if you look at Johnston County ordinances, houses zoned AR are allowed to have livestock, horses, chickens, within reason. So I'm going to say this out loud. My zoning in Johnston County says I can have chickens. But I live in a neighborhood, and my neighborhood has restrictive covenants, which are private land use control. Right? The developer who owned the property as a private landowner set these rules, saying that everybody who lives in this neighborhood can't have chickens. Well, folks, guess what? I can't have chickens. Even though JOCO says I can, my restrictive covenants say I can't. That's what I mean by the more strict overrides the less strict. No. No crying in the corner. So, let's start with the public land use controls, folks. As I said, it's the government, okay? So, we say use of police power. They can enforce the laws. It is the government, right? That's kind of the whole purpose. The government has a lot more power than we do as individuals, unfortunately. And so, there is what we call the Enabling Act. Don't confuse that with the Machinery Act. The Machinery Act gives the powers to the municipalities to tax real property. The Enabling Act gives the powers to the municipalities to govern zoning. Tells you what you can and can't build in a certain area. And the reason is for the betterment of the public. I told you, zoning, as part of your public land use controls, are the reason why your neighbor can't open a bar in a cul-de-sac. Because most other people around there wouldn't like it. Same reason why you wouldn't see very often, I'm not going to say it doesn't happen, a big residential community right near a manufacturing plant or, right near high rises. It kind of is the government saying, here's what we want to see in certain places because we think it makes the most sense. Now, there's a lot of different pieces that go into public land use controls. Of course, the planning boards, what we call the master plan that the planning board kind of sets. Zoning, which is kind of a map of here's what we'd like to see, and the ordinances are the rules for those maps. Subdivision regulations. Now, word of caution here, folks. When I say subdivision regulations, you got to be very careful. I'm gonna have a slide for this. Subdivision regulations are a public land use control, meaning whether or not you can or can't build a subdivision. Don't confuse those with subdivision restrictive covenants, which are a private land use control. A lot of students confuse those because one's public, one's private, and they kind of sound similar. Of course, building codes are part of the public land use controls, and there is lots of environmental protection legislation as well, both on a local and federal level that come into play from a public point of view. So when I talk about the planning board and the master plan, folks, there is literally a map and proposed things, typically very long plan in nature, about 20 years out is what they look at. And they consider things like growth trends, population densities, road planning, how much do we need for infrastructure things and community things, right? Do we need a library? Do we need more schools? Do we need to have some parks? Do we need more venues for different things? And so if you ever drive through a municipality and you think to yourself, when I say municipality, I just mean city or town, and you think to yourself, oh, this place is so cute. It flows so well. I like all the neat things they have. That community probably had a good planning board and probably had very gradual estimated growth, which means they could kind of figure things out. Conversely, if you ever drive through an area and you're like, this town sucks, I freaking hate it, there's too many stoplights, the traffic doesn't flow well, why the hell are there so many mattress stores, who the hell even buys mattresses from mattress stores, right? Like when you have that kind of mentality, you're like, maybe they didn't have a great planning board, or maybe they grew too rapidly, right? And that's where you get areas with very bad traffic issues and bad flow, and the whole point of the master plan is to continue to make it a desirable place to live. Because if people hate the place, they're going to leave. And if people leave, then they're not making tax money anymore, or the values go down, and a lot of different things happen. There you go. Chelsea just shared something with Pittsburgh. Oh, you're talking about the Disney project over there with everything that's going on. Yeah. And Chatham Park and all that fun-filled jazz. Yeah. I think, I don't think they're going to sell anything, is what I heard, for Disney until like 2026. 2027?
My husband's doing the project.
Is he? I was about to say 2027 is, yeah, that's right. He's part of the project?
He's leading the project, yeah.
Oh, look at him. That's pretty cool. Is he a contractor, or like, what is he?
He works for the developer.
Okay. That's pretty cool. I like it. Fancy. Yeah, it's a big talk in the real estate industry. Everybody's like, ooh, Disney. I'm like, okay, yeah, we'll see. I mean, it sounds neat, right? I mean, that's a good upcoming area anyway out there. So, master plans, there's a lot of different pieces to it. Now, let's talk about the other aspect, folks. And this is, of course, where we get into more of the language side of things. Zoning should be thought of as kind of like a map, folks. There's literally, I told you, my zoning right now for my house is AR, agricultural residential. There is no one size fits all for zoning. Every city does it slightly differently. Every county does it slightly differently. Every state does it slightly differently. The concept's the same, but like AR may or may not be something that's in Wake County, whereas it is in Johnston County. It just depends. They all get to kind of come up with their own system. So there is no statewide standard, no countrywide standard. A couple other pieces of language that kind of come into the zoning. There's what we call an ETJ. And you've probably heard this before. It stands for extraterritorial jurisdiction. Extra meaning outside of, territory meaning the city limits, and jurisdiction is we still have jurisdiction. And so it would be like, okay, well, you've got Wake County, and you've got, well, actually, I'll give you a visual here. If you've got Wake County as a whole, and then you got Raleigh city limits, Raleigh's going to have their own zoning for the city limits of Raleigh versus Wake County zoning that are not in the city limits. But an ETJ typically goes about like 3 miles outside of, depending on the municipality, that says, okay, well, even though this 3 miles outside of the city limits are not paying city taxes, they're not in the city limits, they still may have jurisdiction on the zoning because it's so closely tied to the city limits of Raleigh. So that's your ETJ. And when we're dealing with zoning, folks, understand that it could be for anything that's not illegal. Let me help you out right here, right now. Listen to me very carefully. The answer to the test question will never be limits who can own the property. It would be unlawful to restrict who can own property. Keyword own. You can restrict sometimes who can live there, but you cannot restrict who owns it. So you would never be able to pass a law that states that you can't own this property unless you're a certain race, color, religion, or age, or anything like that. Okay, it will never be lawful to restrict who owns property. So that'd be an example of something that's illegal. But they could restrict anything that's not illegal, right? They could tell you that your building has to be at least 1,000 square feet. They could tell you that you can't have goats. They could tell you that you can't build a restaurant. They can tell you that, you know, you can't have more than 72 parking spaces. Whatever they want to do. So here's an example of a zoning map. It's not a one-size-fits-all. I told you every single map looks kind of different. But if you look, this is based in like Arizona somewhere. This is, what is it? Mesa. If you look at all the different colors, it's kind of hard to see on the slide. All these beigeish colors are different types of residential. And sometimes they'll rank them into like low density and high density, right? Meaning condos versus townhouses versus single family detached versus mixed use versus whatever. So you got residential in your beigeish colors. You've got commercial in these reds and pinks. Mixed use, gray and kind of peach. Employment, blue and purple. Public and institutional. There's no one size fits all. You got to understand that these are all just, here's what we would like to see here. So the zoning is these classifications. And then the ordinances are kind of the rules within. Here's what you can and can't build within this zoning. And this is all dictated by the planning board and all that fun-filled jazz. So here's where we get into the vocab side of things, as I told you, because that's a lot of this section is just vocab. So let's say that we had commercial 2 was the zoning. And commercial 2's ordinances said you can build a restaurant, you can build a warehouse, you can build a gym, just as an example. If you buy a property zone commercial 2 and you build one of those, that is what we call a conforming use. Conforming means you conform to the zoning and ordinances. You are following the rules, conforming. If you're not following the rules, it's called a non-conforming use. Now understand that a non-conforming use could be both legal or illegal, depending. And what it's depending on is timing. So for example, if you buy the property that's zoned commercial 2, where it says restaurant, warehouse, or gym, and you buy it and you build a residential house on it, that is an illegal non-conforming use because you just blatantly disregarded the laws and you did what you wanted to. And the police can come after you. They can charge you criminally for violating ordinances, police powers. So a legal non-conforming use is when you are grandfathered in. Folks, municipalities change. And so sometimes the planning board will look at something and they'll say, okay, well, and by the way, these are very large pockets, right? Like miles and miles and miles. It's not like typically itty bitty pieces of property. So let's say that they had this big area zone, commercial 1, and one of the things that was allowable was a grocery store. And so you had a grocery store, here on this parcel of land, and you were conforming to the commercial 1 zoning. And let's say the planning board comes in and they say, well, listen, it doesn't really fit with our growth pattern. I think we want to rezone this whole area as residential 2. And so you will get a notice of public hearing. Have you ever seen those signs out on the side of the road? It says notice of public hearing. That's what this is. They say, well, come to the planning board meeting. We're talking about doing this. It's a proposed zoning change. Come and tell us if you're for it or if you're against it. And ultimately the commissioners and the planning board vote on it and they decide if they're going to do it or not. And if it gets approved, they will rezone it. And so then, okay, well, we passed it. This is now R1. It's no longer commercial. Well, they're not going to make you stop operating your grocery store. That wouldn't be very fair. So this is what we call a legal non-conforming use. Yeah, the zoning is now R1, and you don't match what they want to see there, but you built your building when it was a conforming use. So you are now grandfathered in as a legal non-conforming use. Now here's kind of the iffy thing. As long as you follow a set rules, guidelines, or whatever, you could potentially be a legal non-conforming use for forever. Unfortunately, though, they kind of want you to eventually conform, and so they will put restrictions on it. Sometimes they will do something like, okay, well, if your property ever burns down, you can't rebuild it. Just take the insurance money and sell it as residential. They may also put restrictions on if you could sell it. They're not going to let you change it to a different type of business. And even if you needed to apply for a permit to build more parking lots, they're probably going to deny it. Why? Because it's not zoned commercial anymore. So you can legally exist as long as you fit this mold. But timing is the factor. Now, a legal non-conforming use, folks, I want you to understand, be very careful on the test. If I buy a property zoned commercial and I build a residential home on it, that's an illegal non-conforming use. And then if I sell it to somebody else, it's still an illegal non-conforming use. It will never be grandfathered in just because you sold it. If it was illegal to start, it's still illegal. Beverly says, can you petition the planning board for like a special use without changing the zoning laws? Yes. We're about to talk about that. A special use permit or a conditional use permit, depending on the zoning. It depends, and it depends on what you're building. They typically don't do that for businesses, though. When you're dealing with like a business or something like that, you would just need to rezone it. And so understand with like big businesses, folks, when like Apple's like, oh yeah, we're coming in the area. Very rarely is the property that they identify already zoned for what they needed to be zoned for. But when you got millions or billions of dollars being invested into the economy, the planning board is willing to rezone it for you. They're not really willing to rezone it for you and I, the peons, right? You got to be deep pockets, big businesses, but they will rezone it. So be careful, right? Legal non-conforming use versus illegal non-conforming use. So here's what Beverly was just talking about. A conditional use permit, sometimes called a special use permit. This is where they would give permission on a case-by-case basis. They didn't change the zoning, but as long as they have like these conditional use permits, they may say, well, you can put a church in this residential zoning as long as there's not more than 4 churches per like 6 square miles, right? They could be conditions like that where it's for the betterment of a residential area. So even though it doesn't fit the residential mold, we'll allow it based on certain conditions. If it doesn't exceed a certain size, if it doesn't create a certain amount of traffic, if there's not more than X amount, and it would be dependent. They didn't change the zoning. It's just kind of special permissions on a case-by-case basis. Conditional use permit or a special use permit. They got to be very careful with this next one because I just explained that when we're dealing with a big business, right? If this 800 acres is some type of agricultural residential, but Amazon wanted to put a warehouse, and that's going to fall into commercial. Amazon would have to rezone it. Okay? You've got to get it rezoned to be able to build what they want to build. A variance is not rezoning. A variance is where you ask permission to ignore a rule or two. It's a small little, like, can I break a rule? That's all it is. Now, the key piece of a variance, folks, it has to be due to some undue hardship not caused by you that doesn't affect anybody else. And so let me just try to explain this the easiest way I can. How about a commercial building that's like 10,000 square feet, and the zoning ordinance state that a building of 10,000 square feet has to have at least 300 parking spaces, but there's some type of riparian buffer that runs through it, which is dealing with vegetation and water flow. And so they say, okay, well, you can't build within 30 feet of that riparian buffer. And so because of this, you can't get more than 200 parking spots instead of the 300 that you need. You may go and ask them and say, would you approve this with 200 parking spots versus the 300? Your building qualifies, right? It meets the zoning. You're not changing the zoning. You're just basically asking for permission to ignore one of the rules based on these unforeseen circumstances that you didn't cause. Are they going to automatically grant it? No. But you can ask for it. Just understand that it is not rezoning. A lot of students get those confused. Rezoning is a big change, right? Like, you are changing everything about that. It's not zone this anymore, it's zone something else. Variance says, we didn't change the zoning, we just gave you permission to ignore a rule or two. Brad says we had to get a variance for our pool because the pool company built the pool too big and it was 2 feet too close to one of the property lines. Not our fault, so it was approved. There you go. That's a prime example. So it was built too close to the setbacks, and you basically had to ask permission for it to be okay. And if they grant it, that is a variance. They're going to say, well, we're not going to go after you. You're not in compliance. We didn't change the zoning, but we're not going to go after you because we're giving you permission to ignore this one little thing. What you got, Cheyenne?
Would something like that be material fact if, like, we were going to sell Brad's house? Like, would we have to let the next owner know, like, hey, there was a variance on...
Arguably, yes. Of course, if the government says it's okay, it's not like a super significant material fact because they did say it was okay, but I would say it would be something that people would want to know. Absolutely. Beverly says, so do these variances remain in place as long as the structure is there? Does it have to be reapproved? No, it stays there. Unless, like, something changes with the structure or you're trying to do something different. But, yeah, otherwise it'll stay there. It's kind of like, and this is where some people in HOAs are ridiculous. Like, don't confuse them because, of course, HOAs are dealing with private land use controls. But, like, if you go to, like, your architectural board and get a shed approved, and then the board changes over and somebody tries to ding you for your shed, they're like, well, it's not. No. The HOA approved it. You cannot go back on it. One of the HOA boards approved it. So, people are ridiculous sometimes. So let me block off something here because, yet again, this is one of those areas that students have a tendency to get confused on. So let me block off this right about here. And you'll see why I did this in just a second, okay? Your next kind of vocab is called an overlay district. An overlay district is where two different types of zoning are overlapping each other. Now, some municipalities don't use this because they'll just have like a special category for mixed use. But let me give you a couple examples here. There may be residential towards the coast. So some type of residential R1, R2, whatever. But there may also be some type of flood zoning that says, okay, well, these residential homes have to be built on stilts. or have to have certain wind ratings or certain things like that. And so then you've got a type of residential zoning over a special flood restriction zoning. That'd be an overlay district. Two different types of zoning overlapping each other, and ergo both are required. Let me give you another example, and this is why I covered it up, because I don't want you to think that these are the same thing, because they're not. Folks, if you think of like downtown Wilmington, downtown Raleigh, a lot of like older cities, there are historic homes that have been around for large chunks of time. And so there is what we call historic preservation zoning, which is what I covered up here, which states that these homes would have to be maintained a certain way, cannot be demolished, would have to be repaired a certain way, they have to meet certain historic criteria. And this is for cultural and historic significance. Well, in those areas where there is these historic homes, they are zoned some type of historic preservation zoning, but they are also probably zoned some type of residential. There you go. There's another example of two overlapping each other. And even sometimes yet, the historic homes actually get converted into a mixed use or commercial. And a lot of municipalities will turn them into offices. So it could be a type of commercial office space overlapping with historic preservation zoning. The reason why I covered up historic preservation zoning, though, is because when you first see it, and if I use that as the example, students start to think that's the same thing. It's not. One's just an example of the other. Historic overlapping with commercial would be an example of an overlay district. Genesis says, like most houses around college campuses, yeah, a lot like that. What you got, Beverly?
Like you used to see a lot more businesses like dental offices and doctor's offices located in residential areas and in neighborhoods. Did something change? You know what I mean? I mean, like years and years, like parents' generations ago, that people don't, the zoning laws changed. Because you don't really see that. Don't really see like a lot of home-based professional businesses in neighborhoods anymore.
Once upon a time when we had to drive horses everywhere, you probably wanted them a little closer by. Nowadays, when people are having cars and stuff, it really doesn't make sense for people to be operating home businesses in residential areas unless there's like some real finite need. Now, to that point, Beverly, like let's go back to my zoning, AR. You can operate a nursery, an elderly daycare center, and like one other type of business. So there's like some businesses that are allowed within some residential zoning. But of course, high density businesses, doctors' offices, office spaces, because of them not wanting high traffic businesses in residential areas, that's why. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense where people would be parking cars in and out of a cul-de-sac, pissing people off for a business, Yeah. So the next one, once again, these are all like just a bunch of vocab, right? Flashcards. You just got to be able to identify these things. So the next one is an aesthetic zoning. Now, folks, let me give you a prime example of an aesthetic zoning. Okay, think tourist places. If you have ever been to the mountains of North Carolina or Gatlinburg or somewhere like that, and you're driving through and you're like, oh, look at that. It's so cute because the cookout is a log cabin. Oh, look, the McDonald's is also a log cabin. Oh, wow, the Starbucks is also a log cabin. It's not because they're cutesy tootsie and they all decided to do it together. It's because the tourist location said they had to. That is aesthetic zoning. They're like, no, we're trying to fit a certain kind of aesthetic here. You can't just be any old McDonald's. You got to be a bougie McDonald's, right? Like Anthony said, you got to be a little bougie. And so that's aesthetic zoning. We want you to look a certain way. We want you to have certain finishes on the outside, certain decor, certain, whatever. That's aesthetic zoning. Listen, everybody's just like throwing it. Preston, Chapel. Yeah, of course. There's certain places, right? Spot zoning. Let me try to explain this one, okay? I told you that zoning, typically very large pieces, right? 10s, 20s of miles, very large, not small typically. So when they're rezoning something, it's square miles typically. So spot zoning is a very unique thing. Let's say that we were dealing with a piece of property in like downtown Raleigh, and it was zoned some type of commercial. And so you had all these businesses, right, along here. And I'll make them a little bit bigger. We'll just kind of give them these businesses. And all these businesses had all these lots that they're at. And this zoning didn't allow them to put parking lots. Because I guess maybe the city wants the public parking. Maybe they want the paid parking. Maybe they want whatever. So they don't allow these businesses to put the parking lots. They could do that. But then, at some point, the planning board approves for this person to have this neighboring lot, and they rezone this one neighboring lot to some type of zoning that can be a parking lot. They didn't rezone everything else, right? Everything else is the same, but they rezoned this one little spot right here for that business to put a parking lot. That would be spot zoning, because they just took a very small chunk and rezoned it. Now, here's the interesting thing about spot zoning. If you can prove that it was not done for the greater good of the municipality, it could be considered illegal and overturned, aka people playing favorites. Now, of course, if you didn't know this, all of this is very political, and everybody is in everybody's pocket, but it's like when it's that blatantly obvious, they can and will overturn it. It can be taken to a judge, so can be contested in court and overturned if not in the public interest, because it's a little too obvious. Yeah, Beverly says builders do this all the time. Yes, they do. Builders, developers, listen, I'm not going to name any names, but some of the biggest builders and developers in North Carolina are also county commissioners, because that way they can approve their own projects. And if they're not there, they're buddy-buddy, and they're donating hundreds of thousands to the re-election campaigns of the other commissioners. That's how it goes. So spot zoning is rezoning a small piece. Not automatically illegal, but could be considered illegal if not for the public interest, and can be overturned through the courts for that spot zoning. That's right, got to pay to play. Ugh, the world we live in. So let me introduce the last two, and that's probably where we'll kind of wrap up the day before I let you chit-chat with me a little bit. Cluster zoning, folks, think properties closer together, which maximizes green space and open space elsewhere. Think cul-de-sacs, right? Cul-de-sacs, everybody's got, 0.2, 0.5, 0.6 of an acre, and so smaller lots means maximize green space either within the community or the municipality. As opposed to areas where everybody owns 80 acres, that's not cluster zoning. So, townhouses, cul-de-sacs, things where smaller size individual lots closer together, which maximizes open space elsewhere, cluster zoning. And then, of course, a buffer zone typically breaks up two other types of zonings that may contrast a little bit. So if you're going from industrial to residential, you may want a buffer zone of like forest or green space or greenways. Why? So you're not like directly staring at an industrial plant from your cul-de-sac. And so they'll have something to break it up. Could be from like downtown Raleigh going into residential areas as well. Some type of breaking up the two different types, residential versus commercial, industrial versus this, agricultural versus that. I think I've tortured y'all enough. Y'all just chit chat with me for the rest of the night. I'll just round up. Because listen, these are the nights where it's just like nonstop talking, and I'm like, man, I can only imagine what your brains are like right now. I get it. What do you want to talk about, folks? Nothing? Brains are too mushy? It's dead.
So where can we find the zoning? Can you find that on GIS?
Yes, there is overlays for zoning on GIS. You would look at the like government overlays, and you can see zoning maps. You can also typically Google like Johnston County zoning map, and you could typically find one on like the planning board's website. And then of course the ordinances are the list of the do's and don'ts for that particular zoning that you can also Google on their planning board website or whatever. And then worst case scenario, you can pick up the phone and call the planning board and say, I would like a copy of the zoning map and or the ordinance restrictions, and they will send it to you. Janet, give you an example for these two on this slide. Where are you at?
Yes.
I thought I did. Where were you at?
My computer was frozen.
Oh, well, somehow that's my fault, huh, Janet? I see how this is. I have to reteach it because your computer was... I'm kidding. Cluster zoning, think cul-de-sacs. Okay, just cluster is clustering homes closer together. Smaller lots, homes closer together, so that you can maximize green space or open spaces in either a community or a municipality. That's a cluster zoning. Could be townhouses, could be cul-de-sac lots. You know, it's just basically smaller lots closer together versus large tracts, large homesteads, large whatever. And then a buffer zone would be like, you know, think of like the greenways in like Cary. So you've got like neighborhood greenways where you can walk and have parks, and then there's like, you know, commercial on the other side of it, or a highway on the other side of it. So that greenway buffers between the highway and the residential areas. That'd be an example. It's just where they'll say, okay, well, we need like trees or a park or greenways, just something so if you're living here, you're not staring directly at this manufacturing plant, or you're not staring directly at this highway. It just buffers the two different contrasting zonings, like commercial to residential.
Okay, thank you.
For sure. I was just picking on it. What you got, Bridge?
Yeah, you mentioned earlier the three types of insurance: the title insurance, hazard insurance, and the third was mortgage insurance.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, could you talk for a second about the mortgage insurance?
Yes. When we get into the financing section, there is sometimes, if you are a slightly higher risk borrower, meaning you're putting a lower down payment, the bank is going to require you to get what's called mortgage insurance. And it is insurance that is protecting the bank for a little bit of money in case you default on the loan because you're a higher risk. And so they say, well, if you want this loan, you got to get mortgage insurance. So it's really for the bank, but you have to pay for it. And then, of course, hazard insurance covers your structure if it, you know, something happens to it. And then title insurance covers the concept of ownership, which is title. Chelsea says, as someone who is interested in diving into real estate part-time at first, what are your thoughts on starting off as a broker in new construction? I have mixed outlooks on that. I used to manage new construction sales teams and work for a developer. I will say there's a couple good things about working for a builder and doing new construction. Number one, you really only have to know one product, which is great because it's your community. The downside is builders are, hate to say it, some of the more shady individuals in the real estate world. And so they could ask you to do things that are not necessarily legal from a licensing point of view that could put your license at risk. And they're going to expect you to bend over backwards for them, even though it's not legally okay. I'll give you an example of that. An agent I used to work with, she worked for a different builder, and I represented them in some sales because my developer provided them some land. We just started talking again earlier this year, and she was representing a builder who wanted her to lie in the MLS and state that the property was in Fuquay when it was actually in Anger. Well, that's a misrepresentation, and by doing that, she's subject to disciplinary action by the commission. But the builder wanted her to because they thought Fuquay would sell better than Andrew. So they were trying to lie on there. I mean, that's just one small example. So you've got to understand, builders play by their own set of rules, and they're not looking after you. They're looking after themselves. So there's some danger there. Now, that being said, Chelsea, I had an agent who worked for me a couple of years ago, and she was in one of my communities wrapping up, and then went to another one. And I think, on average, she made $250,000 for a couple of years there. So we just had so much inventory for her to sell, and she did it well, so that you could make a lot of money. It's consistent. The other bad side about it is it's kind of like a 9 to 5, because most builders lock you in a new home community. So even though you're not an employee, in a lot of instances, they treat you like one. And so you got to be there 5 days a week. And so you don't have the same flexibility. But I mean, you learn a lot. It is very hard, though, to transition from that, because when you only know new construction and then you transition to general brokerage, you got a lot to learn. But I think there's absolutely some value there. But one more thing, not all builders are created equally. So, some are worse than others. Just be careful. Yeah.